firstly, thank you for agreeing to speak with us today. It's really awesome. Do you prefer to be called Dr. Banerjee?
You can just call me by my first name, Mita. Yeah,
okay, cool.
That's fine.
And you're a professor at Pitzer College,
right?
Correct. And what classes are you teaching this semester?
This semester I'm teaching Intro to Psychology, Child Development, and then an upper-level seminar, Children at Risk.
Okay.
And two of the classes, Child Development and Children at Risk, also have internship components, so students are in the community working with community agencies involved with children.
All students? That are
all the students in both of those classes.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. And what... you have taught various courses from when I looked on your profile that have ongoing research components sometimes as well with socio-emotional development, risk and resilience to childhood, which you mentioned, parent-child emotion interactions. It seems to me that your heart really lies in like youth and youth development. Would that be accurate?
Yeah. My training is as a developmental psychologist, and so child development kind of broadly construed, and the age group that I've worked the most with are preschool and early school age children. So
okay.
They're probably nearest and dearest to my heart, but I love talking about infancy, which we cover a lot of in child development. Mm-hmm. And I have a lot of students who are interested more in youth, as you said, so middle school, adolescence. And also, concerned about that, though that's not as much of a specialty area.
Right, okay. And why the focus on youth? Like, I realize development obviously would start from childhood and go to adulthood, but why not study adults and perhaps their past experiences?
Right. My sense, and I guess there's a lot of good history and psychology focusing on that, is that so much of who we are, the core of who we are, the way we think, the way we approach the world, our level of optimism, our way of processing information is formed in the first years of life. So a lot of people focus on the first 5 years of life. And certainly things can change later in development, but I think that giving human beings kind of a good start in life and giving them sort of opening up all the possibilities and opportunities for them really requires a focus on early years in life and their connections with other people and their educational opportunities. So that's kind of why I've always been concerned with it. Okay,
great. And you talked about the general age range, but do you have any common themes that you found with particularly middle school or high school kids, like in your findings?
Middle school so much of the discussion is around peer relationships, I think, because a lot of researchers talk about how earlier in life sort of family and siblings and that context is all important, and then the transition in middle school and certainly to high school where the peer group becomes really kind of much more influential. So, and one really worries about those kids who are kind of left out of the social milieu, who don't have a lot of good friends or friendships, or if they're bullying, there's a lot that's being written now about bullying kinds of issues. So I'd say the kind of big theme for middle school and into high school are peer relationships and social relationships and what's happening with those.
Okay.
And people can get on really different trajectories if they have friends who are sort of pro-social and doing well in school versus if they have friends who really have a lot of anger, hostility, have had bad experiences, and kind of engaged in more antisocial kinds of behaviors or destructive kind of addiction. So I think that that's a really huge issue and can transform the face of kids' lives depending on what social group they get in with.
That's a great delineation. So another organization that you're part of is House of Ruth. Could you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I spent 10 years, so I'm no longer on the board of directors of House of Ruth, but I did a 7-year stint, and then I took a couple years off, and then they invited me back on the board. And the House of Ruth is a domestic violence agency that has programs for women affected by domestic violence, intimate partner violence, dating violence, all of those kinds of things, as well as having programs for their children who have been affected by that, and parenting programs, etc. So I first got in touch with them when they were just really developing their toddler and children's program, and that was partly why they were interested in having somebody with a developmental background.
Right.
And it's just a really amazing agency, and I realized I was very lucky to work for them because they're not only just very well trained, but they are well run, fiscally kind of on top of their game, always sort of looking ahead to what's changing, and very forward thinking. They were the first ones to really have teen dating violence curricula. And then they really moved away from just shelter. Shelter is what most people think about, but they've moved into sort of transitional kind of care, welfare to work programs, and thinking about how to empower women and how to help heal children to break that kind of intergenerational cycle of violence. So it was very exciting stuff, and I was fortunate to be with them at times when, they bought a new shelter and they, sort of really expanded their programs. And in the economic recession, it was pretty amazing to see how they kind of hunkered down to make sure that even with less money coming to them from private foundations and from federal and other kinds of grants, how they could still make sure they meet the needs of their clients.
Right.
Yeah.
And did you have any particular focus on the child's the children's center portion of it?
Yeah. So I actually helped towards the end of things. They were doing sort of a strategic planning, and then I was focused on the child kind of issues and the child intervention and what's needed there. And they had developed these really interesting, actually, projects through a grant where they were trying to rebuild the parenting relationship that sometimes gets damaged, particularly with mothers and children, if there has been a batterer who has been sort of, denigrating the role of the mother. Then often things are very off kilter where the children no longer really respect the mother doesn't feel empowered to parent. And so they had this very interesting, complicated kind of program where they would have the mother-child interactions, but they would have the mother sort of geared up with earpieces, and they would be sort of talking to her and helping her, as well as other sessions, trying to teach her, again, how to reparent in a way that will be helpful to her children, but that will also reestablish the lines of parent and child.
Okay. That's awesome.
So that was kind of, they do some really, I think, exciting things. And some of the stuff that was most powerful there was when I saw children who were traumatized after immediately coming out of a home where there was a battering situation, and seeing those kids within a period of weeks look like completely different people, having sort of found their joy again, and their sense of security.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. What are other findings that you found across your research, maybe of younger children?
So, well, one of the areas that I'm really interested in now, and the Children at Risk course, actually maybe working on the development of that, put me in that direction, is thinking about resilience and also positive psychology. So much of psychology really always started off, whether it's child or adult, looking at what are our problems and what are the negative things in development, and what do we do about that. But I think sort of flipping that on its head and thinking, what are the strengths, what are the characteristics that people have that allow them to face kind of, challenging situations and come out of it still on the other side in positive ways. And this whole area of positive psychology that I've gotten more interested in, thinking about things like mindfulness and what does it mean to be a 5-year-old and to be mindful, sort of living in the moment, having a sense of optimism, developing a sense of compassion. There's a lot of work now on empathy and compassion. And so those are things that I've gotten really interested in, and in the study that I'm doing right now with some undergrads here have included some parent and child tasks on mindfulness, and I'm thinking about some of the intervention work I've done in Africa with HIV and AIDS-related issues and orphan children, to try to think about how do you develop a mindfulness or positive psychology curriculum that will be helpful, that's culturally appropriate in that context for those kids. So that's the stuff that I'm really excited about.
Yeah, it sounds like it. You can go on it's
I can go on and on.
Right, no, it's great. Talk to me a little more about the Africa trip.
Yeah, so that was, again, it was a Pitzer kind of initiative that Pitzer was just trying to develop courses that would link what students are doing here with what they would be doing in a study abroad site. So I took essentially first-year students who had taken the Children at Risk course here, and then over 6 weeks in the summer in in Botswana, where the college has a study abroad site, they took a course with me on HIV and AIDS in Southern Africa, but at the same time they were doing an internship with an orphan preschool there, so they had one-on-one interaction with kids and with the community, and they were also learning Setswana, which is the local language. So there was a lot that was going on, and what we were trying to do was, first of all, to just kind of get a lay of the land there, but to figure out what sort of socio-emotional interventions we might do that would be helpful, that the community wanted in that orphan preschool setting. And so what my students put together, and there were 6 students, and sort of breaking into teams of 3, they did for the younger kids, like the 3 and 4-year-olds, they did, what was it? It was more of an art therapy kind of approach, and then with the older kids they did socio-dramatic play. So for those kids, giving them ways to express what they had been through, and sort of working on the emotions of loss and sadness and anger and all of those things. So it was pretty fascinating stuff, and it was really challenging too. It was a very different cultural context. There was really intense stuff that these children were going through. My students were very concerned about just sort of coming in, creating these relationships, and then leaving again. And I think thinking really, for first year students, thinking really deeply and ethically about what their responsibilities and their commitments are.
Right. And did you see any different, or a better question, do you think that there are commonalities that are regardless of culture, like from what you've learned?
Yeah. I mean, children are children, you know, and the kind of joy and exuberance that they have, when we would, with the sociodramatic play, and it was like, pretend you're an elephant, or, they have safari animals are part of the backdrop there, but they're just kind of joy and exuberance, and we would do some yoga kind of exercises they'd never seen before. So that just seems common of children everywhere. And there are definitely cultural kind of differences, but the need for nurturance and connection, and in that context, there were some children who were very, very traumatized, who just wanted to be held and just wanted that physical kind of contact. There were other children who were very resilient, who were very engaged and curious about their environment. So I think, those kinds of differences in children's personalities are what you run into wherever you are in the world.
Do you have any personal experiences from your own youth, like regarding this sort of development, that inspired you for this work?
I always was just interested in children. I mean, I remember being 2 and 3 and actually just sitting around and waiting to hold babies. It was like there was, for whatever reason, children and babies always captivated me. I remember I had this How and Why was a series of kind of science books, and I had How and Why on prenatal development when I was 3. So, maybe that set something, set some trajectory going. My parents were both biologists, and so, there was a way in which I was kind of exposed to those patterns of biological development, although I kind of went the psychology direction. So I think there's that. I think I had a very happy childhood, but I also I lived in a community where I saw people who had more challenging experiences in childhood, and I think I saw things, I saw, in some ways, I never experienced, but I saw firsthand the effects of abuse and the effects of maltreatment, and I think all those things made me feel like, child advocacy in one way or another was my calling. And I thought about being an MD, and maybe that would be a route to it. I thought about law and sort of family law, and then ended up, going the child development route.
Nice. Is there a piece of advice that you would give parents when interacting with children, like from your research?
Yeah. I mean, I think that parents really are the best experts about their children. And whatever other textbook information there is, it's always, things are always different in every particular context and with every particular child. And so I think it's good when parents are conscious and conscientious about parenting and do try to get information. But I think it's also helpful for them to understand that they know their children, and that they should listen to their guts. If they're getting advice that just doesn't feel right from other people, and so an example would be like for a while people were saying that, babies shouldn't be picked up when they're sleeping, and there are all these, like Ferber, this guy who came up with all these sort of strict sleep schedules, and a lot of parents felt like, okay, the expert is saying to do this, but it just didn't feel right to be listening to their 2-month-old baby screaming and crying. And I would say it's really important to kind of hear what your gut says about that, and to acknowledge that no parents are perfect and people are going to make mistakes. And that you do the best you can. That's all anybody can ask, I think, as a parent, or anybody who's a teacher, anybody interacting with children. But to kind of try to take a child-centered point of view, I think, is really helpful. That as adults, sometimes we get into our own world, and we'll be like, no, you can't do this, or no, you can't do that. But if you stop for a second and think, what is it like to be this child?
Right.
I think that can be helpful.
Great. And conversely, do you have like a piece of advice that you would give youth that are like dealing with emotional or psychological issues, either in a peer group or in a parental relationship?
I think what's really hard for children, and certainly for young adults, youth, to realize is that things can change. And sometimes whatever is going on, especially if it's something negative, if it's a peer conflict, if something embarrassing has happened at school, or if it's, bullying, or something on social media that somebody's, they feel like it's all over. And it's part of their age that it's very difficult for them to sort of look ahead and think, well, where is my life going to be in 10 years? This is not going to even matter in 10 years. But I think the more that you can kind of give them a sense that it feels huge and it looks huge, but really positive and good things can happen, then I think that's important. And I think the youth who have the hardest time, and there are lots of kids who struggle with suicidal ideation, particularly in certain communities. I think, in Canada we say First Nations, but Native American communities have been ones that have suffered that, refugee kind of communities, kids who have sexual orientation kind of questions, who are transgendered or through the coming out process. I think giving them a sense of hopefulness and that there are answers is really critically important.
Okay. And this is like the one question that we ask everyone for this series, and it's really up to you. It's basically, if you were to be called a Pathfinder or a torchbearer, our series is called Pathfinder. If you were a Pathfinder for a particular thing, what would you call yourself a Pathfinder of?
So, as a teacher here, I feel like my Pathfinder role is to help people find their paths, and that's kind of what I take the most joy in, and I love watching. You just saw I had, somebody who stopped by who's a Pitzer alum. She's going to nursing school now, and so I think when I see my students get captivated by something, and hopefully it's it's often something near and dear to my heart. It's working with children in some form. And particularly some students you just have a very profound connection with, and you sort of follow them in what they do. So I think giving them a sense of their own capacity, because so many of my students are amazing people, and they don't understand how amazing they are just in being kind and good and helpful and wanting to do good work in the world. So I think empowering that, giving them a sense of their own capacity to do that, and then watching them kind of grow and develop. As academics, we like to think we do a lot here, but in some ways, I think we almost like stand out of the way, where you give people the tools, and then you stand out of the way, and you let them bloom, and you let them blossom.
Right.
And so that's the beauty of what I get to do, that I really can see that in so many ways with my students, who then go on in various kinds of ways in their careers, but also as whole people in their own lives, in their personal lives. And with their families and with their partnerships later in life. So I feel like maybe that's that's my role, is to help other people find their way to what fulfills them, what gives their lives meaning.
So maybe a Pathfinder of like fulfillment, or Pathfinder? Kind of, I think fulfillment and a sense of well-being, broadly construed. Yeah, great.
Great shirt.
Thank you.
That just reminded me of Botswana, actually.
Oh, yeah?
I was looking at